Okay, thanks, James. I'm going to sort of whiz through this a little bit. It's very important that the real fellows had their time to speak properly, and I will try and get us to coffee as quickly as possible. So I'm very privileged, actually, to work on this site. This was set up by the Wellcome Trust in 1992 to sequence the human genome. And it was set up in competition with private organizations who wanted to keep the genome private. It was actually set up by John Sulston, and we contributed around 50% of the human genome over the next 10 years from 92. And the key to it is it's funded almost entirely by the Wellcome Trust, which is a charitable trust, and our policy is open access. The open access not only of our data, but open access of our software and informatics, which I think is very important in terms of the concept of how partnerships can work. So the site is actually a beautiful parkland, actually, in about 10 miles south of Cambridge. It's got a conference centre, but importantly, it's got beautiful accommodation for visitors, so we can put people up on site. We've actually, on here, we've just built two buildings. One is a Genome England sequencing hub, and it's basically there to sequence patients for the National Health Service. We estimate that we're probably going to sequence between 100,000 to 500,000 people in the next 10 years. And that means that genomes are going to become all about people. It's really around the translation of genetics into society. And also, we've also built a building here, which is really a hub for the EU to distribute that into the clinical systems around Europe. And it will go on from Europe across the world. And I'll explain a little bit how that's going to happen. And we have the European Bioinformatics Institute. We're really a data engine. We heard about radio telescopes. We've got bigger computers than those guys, obviously, with more data in it. But we're actually really a data hub, an open access data hub where people can come to feed it and get information and work with that information. It's actually empowering. If you're working at a remote site and can access the information, have the tools, there's a potential to do science actually with real data that other people haven't actually analyzed. So the areas that we operate in is human genetics. So we have we're not only interested in the disease, but the evolution of human beings and how they evolved. We've got cancer programs, pathogens. We've got a big malaria program. We've got computational hubs, and we've also got cellular genetics. But we're not like a university. We've also got big engines. We've got big sequencing hubs where we can drive through sequencing data. We've got stem cell facilities, and we've got other model organisms. So we basically, if you like, a cross between an academic institution and an industrial type institution. We're attracting a lot of interest at the moment for the pharmaceutical industry because of the idea of targeting therapeutics to particular genotypes in the human population. So there's very much an interest in the idea of personalized medicine. That not only applies to the use of drugs, but also to the use of vaccines in the future as well. So the way we've gone about trying to integrate overseas is we're a global organization. We operate through the Wellcome Trust overseas units. There's one in Kalifi in Kenya and Blantyre in Malawi. We've got one in Durban. We've got excellent interactions with those and beyond. But we also went a step further. If you're talking about research leaders in Africa, here's a research leader in Africa. One of the most outstanding scientists I've ever met, Sam Kariuki. He recently got the Pfizer Award from the Royal Society for his discovery of a new form of salmonella disease in Africa. Absolutely an outstanding mentor, and Abdoulaye Djimde here is actually, Abdoulaye Djimde, he's actually a malariologist, he's a pharmacologist who works in Mali. So both of them actually work out in the field, but they're both fully fledged faculty members of the Sanger Institute. They're equal to us. They can access all of our data and all of our information. And I don't know if the university's done that, appointed anybody of these fellows to the faculty, but it's something you might want to think about. I did recently hear that one of the major tropical schools in the UK had never appointed an African lecturer, which was quite remarkable. Something we need to think about, how we can take these things forward. But we've got multiple projects across Africa analysing pathogens, but also starting to analyse the genetics of humans in Africa. And there's got profound ethical and medical implications associated with that. I put this list together recently, and this is the kind of different, for any of you who's a microbiologist, these are all projects that we run at the Sanger on different pathogens, and I was actually astounded by this. There's almost every pathogen you can think of, we've got a project. And of course, we can't work on, the faculty cannot work on all of these projects, but what we do is we initiate projects for outside collaborators who can then drive the projects. And many of these projects are actually driven by people working in Africa who will approach me and say, well, actually, I've got an issue in Uganda or an issue in Mozambique. I've got material I need to analyze. Can you help us? They can bring the material to us, we'll analyze it, and when we send the information back to them. So this is critically important in the days of the internet. It's not that, it's actually the reverse of what we normally would have, where you get people going out to Africa and collecting data and going back. It's actually people sending the information to us, and we send the data back to them to analyze. And that's a mental difference that you need to think about when you're really going to set up science in Africa. You have to set up science in Africa by African scientists with African data to drive African solutions. And I'll come back to the very end in my final talk. We also are empowering, because this is actually a map in Calcutta, but Sam Kariuki is developing similar maps in Nairobi. Well, this is the distribution of cholera cases in on a vaccine site, actually, in Calcutta. Now, these are all cases of cholera, but notice they're all different coloured. And the reason, now, historically, they would have all been cholera cases, but because we can now sequence the genomes of these organisms, we can discriminate them, and we can not only tell where somebody's got cholera, but we can say who got cholera from who got cholera from who, and transmission track. And this is also coming into the level of the global infectious diseases, the local infectious diseases, even into hospitals, that would be able to track the movement of pathogen from one person to another and bring interventions very much earlier on in terms of the treatment of infectious disease. And the treatment of infectious disease will move away from antimicrobials, antivirals, much more into surveillance and into intervention of diseases, particularly antimicrobial resistant diseases, before they actually evolve. Again, that's also a situation we can empower people working in the field, working on sites, not necessarily working in the best laboratories in Western countries. Another example of how we start projects is this is Iruka over here, who recently became an MSc African leader. She's actually on the faculty of Haverford University in the USA. She trained with me, and she's just going back to Abadan University, which we heard about earlier on, and she's going to become a faculty member there and work in Africa. This is Stephen Obara, who was trained by Sir Brian Greenwood in the Gambia. He's based in Nebraska, but he's also got field sites in Abuja and Kano. And this is one of my students, Chinyere Okoro, who has just recently become a Bianca Weiss Fellow. And the three of these people have just recently approached David and the teams here to see whether they can create a Nigerian hub for studies on enteric diseases in Africa. We're hoping that with Pauline's help and David's help, this will be initiated. I'd like to see Iruka on the faculty at the university. So I challenge anybody here to try to think about whether that could happen. And also then bringing PhD programs to back these fantastic scientists up. Iruka recently wrote a beautiful textbook actually on how to run a laboratory in a developing country. If anybody's interested, you can find it on Amazon. It's actually a beautiful description of some of the challenges of actually trying to work in tropical areas. But human genetics, now human genetics is coming to Africa like a train, whether you like it or not. It's coming into the UK, the idea of having your own genome sequence and revealing your own genetic history. So we have a number of programs that have been funded. Interestingly, classically people would say in Africa people will study infectious diseases, but actually most Africans are interested in non-communicable diseases, diabetes, obesity, the management of issues associated with classical cancers they're very interested in. And all of these programs are going to be coming together in the next few years. These are some of the people, Man Sandu, who is a part of the Global Health Institute here, is driving a lot of this. And unfortunately, these figures, because of the translation from Mac onto PC, we've obscured some of the collaborators. But these are networks, actually, which are working right across Africa. These are the sites that Man just set up to start to study chronic diseases in Africa and to try to develop capacity. One of the problems you've got in Africa is that there's very few people trained to do human genetics. It used to be a disease of statistical analysis, where it's becoming much more now a science of statistical analysis, but it's becoming much more a science now of reading sequence and intervening and identifying differences in people in real time. The other thing is that we are coordinating the African Genome Project. So that's the idea of sequencing all diversity across Africa. Of course, humans evolved out of Africa, and there's more diversity. So that program is in fully fledged mode. sequencing thousands of people across Africa. Basically, you're going to be able to look at the evolution of human beings in Africa. I've already seen some fantastic data that's coming about how you can look at some of the historical spread, particularly around Ethiopia, some of the early movements of people across Africa. On top of that, you can build interest in susceptibility to disease. We talked about cattle. I'm sure that Mark's right. We will solve some of these issues in susceptibility to trypanosomes in cattle, but there'll be a lot of progress made in terms of how people have evolved different traits or different susceptibilities or resistance to different genes, different diseases. We run a big program. This is Dominic Kwiatkowski, called MalariaGen. We've got probably the biggest malaria program. I think it's probably the biggest in the world in terms of the diversity of not only of human genetic susceptibility to malaria. We're monitoring parasite populations across the world. And we're also doing analysis of the mosquitoes, looking at if anybody's interested, the genetics of the vectors of diseases in a very comprehensive way. And this is all run as a completely open access program. All the data is available for people to analyze. People often come in and study their local populations and take the data back and do their own analysis in the field. The thing I've learnt about scientists working in, particularly young scientists working in so-called developing countries, they're not interested in doing science. They're actually interested in doing the best quality science possible. They're not interested nowadays of settling for second best. People who go into science, like yourselves, want to do the best quality science. And I think with the information data that we've got nowadays and the ability to move data around, there's real opportunities to move data back out into the field, away from really labs which have dominated for the last 20 to 30 years, which are high molecular type ends, like the Sanger Institute to some extent. Something we need to think about how that could be built into as part of this program. We also, the Wellcome Trust runs advanced courses, and we've initiated a lot of courses across the world. They're basically, anybody could apply to run a course. The money's available to do it. You could run the course annually. You can train people. You can take your own topics. And we started to set up course hubs in Africa, initially at the Wellcome units, for example, in Blantyre. Sam is running his own course now in Kalifi. They become hubs then for training. They could become hubs for training for pathogen genomics. They could become hubs for training for human genetics. And so I'd like to see these also integrated into the Cambridge African situation. I'd like to see the Cambridge African group running their own advanced courses, but by African scientists in Africa. And so this is run by Julian Rayner over here, who's the coordinator of this. But there is a potential here for a lot of if you like, capacity building and training, particularly in informatics. You can set up informatics hubs, work remotely. We recently got a grant from the MRC to set up a big bioinformatics hub in Uganda at the MRC virus unit in Uganda, management, and Pontiano, the director of the unit in Uganda. And that will be building capacity in Uganda in the next 5 years. It could transform science in Uganda because it's got potential to do a lot of the analysis actually in real time in Entebbe rather than somewhere remote. Something for people to take a grip of, really. And the last thing is that I worked in the vaccine industry for 10 years in the 1980s. We talk about entrepreneurialism. And I've been very interested in trying how to get vaccines from rich countries into poor countries. There's a real issue, as we all know, about getting vaccines to the people who really need them. And often part of it is that the vaccines that are actually made by the multinationals are not suited for use in Africa. So what you really need is an African industry making vaccines in Africa by Africans. So how do you go about doing that? Well, actually, historically, before the globalization, vaccines were made country by country. The UK had its own vaccine business. And there were many African countries did have their own vaccine business, so many European countries had their own vaccine business, but they were driven out by acquisition by multinationals. But there's a sort of reverse psychology going on at the moment. For example, in India, India has now invested and reinvented its own vaccine business over the last 10 years. They've actually been very entrepreneurial and developed their own business psyche. So what I've been interested in the last few years is how would you go about doing it in Africa? One of the problems is if you lose an industry, you lose expertise and you lose a culture. And there's no scientific basis for anybody to go. You can talk about being an entrepreneur, but if you don't have the knowledge, how can you actually deliver the product? But there are some places, this company in South Africa called Biovac, the Biovac Institute, that do have the ability to make vaccines. They generally market vaccines from multinationals. But I joined the SAB of Biovac 5 years ago. I don't get paid for it. But I'm interested in the idea of generating a vaccine industry in South Africa, and it's starting to happen. I'm also on the board of this Hilleman Laboratories in India, which is a Wellcome Trust MSD Merck Sharp and Dougan initiative to develop vaccines for developing countries, for not-for-profit. Wellcome Trust put £50 million into it. The Merck put £50 million into it, and we're developing projects. We've got a rotavirus project for stabilized vaccines that work outside of the cold chain. You've heard about the problems of vaccines outside the cold chains. Can we stabilize vaccines that could be used to deliver to remote areas, and particularly areas under duress? And we have that project. And these other initiatives have sprung up. And so I would like to see these sort of initiatives work together, and particularly to build an institute like Biovac in Africa, train Africans to make their own vaccines. Gates have recently put a lot of money into this. The Wellcome Trust will be putting money into it. We're trying to persuade GSK to get involved in it. But I think that's the way in which we will have to build the scientific infrastructure in these sorts of countries, starting from these sorts of initiatives. But that's all I wanted to say. I think I got through that pretty quickly. James, you can be happy about that. But thank you very much.